Welcome back, everyone. We're going to start with the panel 2 for today, which is titled Holocaust, Genocide, and Politics of Naming. My name is vis-a-vis. I'm a graduate student at the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, so I will be moderating this session. We're going to have 3 presentations, and after the presentations, we're going to do 3 mini presentations on the current dissertation projects, so we can kind of enter into a multi-layered dialogue. So we will begin with Professor Carlos Pavon's paper today. I'll introduce him. Carlos Pavon is a professor of history at the University of Puerto Rico. He is the author of 3 books: Nación Post-Mortem, Ensayos sobre los tiempos de insoportable ambigüedad, Polémicas políticas intelectuales, violencia, and Mínima política, textos breves y fragmentos sobre la crisis contemporánea. He is also editor of the collection of essays titled El pasado ya no es lo que era, la historia en tiempos de incertidumbre. Currently, he is working on a book on the ethical and political implications of the representations of genocide and other forms of extreme violence in the 20th century, and the problem of history and memory of traumatic events in Latin America.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. First of all, I want to thank the sponsors and the activity for the invitation. I was here in October. I had to meet some people who are here today. I'm glad to see their faces. Of course, I have a friendship relationship with many years now. So kind to invite me again. I want to just say a small disclaimer about the last thing. So there's really read in Spanish about me. Before that, I do not work in the field of genocide studies nor Holocaust studies. I am a historian who works problem of the representation of events of extreme violence, and specifically with the intersection between history and memory. And I say this because I've been hearing many debates during the day where something, for me, curious has been happening. Everybody acknowledges that there are different definitions of genocide, but then sort of everybody starts discussing genocide as if everybody agrees on what it is. And I think the subject position of who's speaking makes a difference. It's not that one approach is better than the other, it just makes a difference that should be acknowledged in the dialogue, because there are tensions and contradictions. When you speak as an advocate, as a policymaker, as an activist, as an academic, not necessarily. The implications of what you're saying are the same in the field of studies, especially this one. So with that disclaimer, I will try to synthesize my paper. I begin by stating that a growing chorus of voices, journalists, writers, academics, political and religious leaders, civic associations, social and political activists, among others, is increasingly using the term genocide to name it the diverse range of expressions of extreme violence entailing the mass murder of civilians. The processes of traumatic violence in Argentina, Chile, you can mention Uruguay also, Sudan, Bosnia, Darfur, Syria, and the Israeli-Palestine conflict are a few examples among many of events that are subject of controversy, which are referred to with the word genocide. Furthermore, the images of these processes of extreme violence are disseminated all over the world on our TV sets, overseas TV at this point, TV series, movies, documentaries, online, streaming, photography exhibits, videos, and other types of digital and visual media. So we live, it's my contention, in an age of hyper-visibility of the term genocide. That was not always the case. Actually, I also argue that, and it's not my argument, I'm just following several historians here, I think there's a consensus on this, that this is a fairly recent development, this hyper-visibility. Basically, I think there are two main factors that help explain, in part, this hypervisibility. One is the end of the Cold War, and with it, a sort of revising of the history of the 20th century, more from the year 2000 onwards. First texts on the 20th century that came immediately after the Cold War still were centered on the conflict between capitalism and socialism. Terry Hobsbawm's Age of Extreme being the sort of paradigmatic text there. But I think since the year 2000 at least, this paradigm of 20th century historiography has been displaced, and the 20th century has been come to historians. There's a consensus that it is named the century of genocides. Not the century of the Cold War, not the conflict between socialism and communism, the century of genocides. So first, there is a displacement of the narrative, the general narratives, the universal narratives of the 20th century centered on the Cold War. And the second factor is that in that displacement, with what's been called the awakening of the age of memory, the Holocaust, or more precisely, the memory of the Holocaust became globalized, as has been said many times today, as a metaphor that symbolizes the social horrors and catastrophes of the 20th century. And in that way, it helped usher an era where the linkage between Holocaust and genocide became, as has been stated since this morning, a very strong one, provoking at the same time many disputes and debates. However, this process of hypervisibility has not meant that there's more clarity or precision in answering the question of just what genocide is or how these processes should be studied. On the contrary, I would like to propose that this hypervisibility has all too often led to an abusive use of the term and to a political instrumentalization of the notion of genocide in today's contemporary world. I would argue also that the legal definition of the Genocide Convention has not resolved the problem, as for me is evident in these proceedings and all the readings that I do about genocide. The legal definition has been debated and questioned and has been problematic since its inception. Many people have talked about Lemkin and Lemkin today, but Lemkin's definition was not the definition adopted by the UN in the first place. And second of all, what has happened with that definition, and that's what I'm going to propose, is that for historical analysis purposes, at least, it has, in my understanding, hindered more than it has helped or promote a clearer understanding of genocide as a historical process. But also, the debates around the legal definition of genocide have demonstrated that there is no common understanding and there's not a common conceptual denominator of this concept. So when Richard this morning said, I have a list of all these genocides, well, many of them, I could argue, are genocide if we have a certain understanding, which is the legal definition of genocide, but not necessarily others. So it's still contested, although this is impressive, and I get the argument, I think it was persuasive about how this shows that post-colonial states engage in genocide. I think the list assumes that we have all a common understanding of they are all genocides. This is genocide because it's clearly stated by the convention. So I think that there's still a problem there that I know this debate has been going on for decades, but I think it's useful if we sort of state that there's still not, and maybe will never be, a common conceptual denominator, but that is not the only problem. Maybe it's not even the most important problem. I think that the problem, or one of the most important problems with the legal definition is that it is not just too narrow, as was stated this morning. It is, as Eric White has stated in one of his books, Century of Genocide, it is simultaneously too narrow and too broad. So there is a dialectical process of narrowing and expanding, and depending on what processes are studied, you take two different books on genocide, and one will say about Stalinism, well, this was genocide, the organization of the land was genocide, or the hunger in Ukraine was genocide, but the population purges of 1937-41 on in the Second World War was ethnic cleansing. It doesn't rise to genocide. So there's not even consensus about those issues because it is too narrow or too broad, and depending on how the historian uses it, if it uses it restrictively, some events will be characterized as genocide, but others will not. That ambiguity, which includes the notion of intent, destroy, in part. What is in part? As such, I mean, if you take the key component of the definition, all of those words are contested. And that is the nucleus of the definition. So it is problematic even in the nucleus of the definition, and even the notion that why those groups and not other groups, and some argue because these are objectively speaking groups which people cannot renounce them. They are born into them, not political groups, because those groups are groups that are voluntarily chosen, for example, is also contested, because as I understand it, not only racial is a construct, ethnic is a construct, national is a construct. All of those groups are constructs, so there's no objectivity. So in that case, we would have to look for other reasons which are historical and then be defended of why those groups. But that remains a problem. But this is what I want to argue in part. The ambiguity of the term and the notion that, as was spoken this morning by Barbara Frey in her comments, the understanding that genocide is considered to be the highest crime against humanity, or the crime of all crimes, has created a moral and legal hierarchy that many times has led to having the victims of mass murder, or those who are in solidarity with the victims, wanting to have the situation they have endured to be recognized as genocide. Because what is suggested is that any victim of any event which constitutes a mass atrocity would claim, or wants to claim, a sort of victimhood of a specific type of extreme violence, because if it's not, which is genocide, because if it's not recognized as genocide, it is trivialized. It doesn't matter. It's insignificant because it doesn't rise to be the crime of all crimes. So from that perspective, that creates the whole competition among victims and the whole notion of victimhood in terms of hierarchy, which comes to the issue of which victims are considered victims of genocide and which are not, and who has the moral, political, and legal authority to call an event of extreme violence genocide. This competition is usually articulated in social and political spaces, memory associations, groups of family members of victims who disappeared, human rights organizations, political groups, but is encouraged by the ambiguity and the legal definition of the term, which is a fertile ground for this kind of political use of memory, which is this competition of victimhood, because there need to be recognized as being victims of genocide, because if not, falls in the category mass atrocity or mass murder, does not have the legal or moral implications. In the case of Latin America, I have to
hurry up. The use of genocide has been linked with the use of the Holocaust in the representation of the events of extreme violence in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Brazil, and other Latin American countries. This has posed a dual problem or possibility. On the one hand, and I'm talking about literary expressions here specifically, the notion of having to be compared in that sense, that I recognition with the Holocaust as the most extreme form of genocide, has led several authors to question the limits of a mimetic realism to represent the experience. So writers have strived to create elusive, euphemistic, allegorical, or display strategies to represent this experience of extreme violence, and this has been very, very productive in terms of literary production of other forms of representation of extreme violence. But at the same time, even adopting these strategies, they have established, especially in Argentina, I know Alejandro's going to speak about this, an equivalence between the Argentine military dictatorship and the Holocaust. That is to say, they assume the Holocaust as the metaphor and paradigm for representing the experience of extreme violence in Argentina, less so in Chile, but also in Uruguay and other parts. So, on the one hand, by becoming the paradigm or the model of memory of extreme violence in Latin America specifically, there has been a creation of alternative modes of representation that have been very, very effective in transmitting the experience of extreme violence. At the same time, and this has made visible, sometimes through alternative, as I say, strategies, what had been invisible. I mean, how do you make visible the desaparecido? How do you represent the desaparecido, who by definition is not there? So they have done all these allegorical sort of narratives. So that, one would say, was a productive use of the analogy, or the sort of fusion of the Holocaust and the military dictatorship, because it produced a representational strategy that was effective, and much more effective than traditional mimetic representation. But on the other hand, the strategy can also be an obstacle that could silence, and has silenced, the specific nature of the stories and memories of traumatic historical experiences of extreme violence, which, although they may be obviously comparable to the Holocaust, are specific or singular to Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, just to mention 3 cases. And I am thinking again of the experience of the disappear or the transition to democracy. The question we can ask then is if the metaphor of the Holocaust makes the specific experience of extreme violence more visible, or whether it makes the victims invisible, or whether it does both things at once. And this should lead us to investigate what is being made visible and what is being made invisible, and what are the ethical and political effects of this invisibility in other countries in the context of the cases of Latin America. Moreover, it could lead to a critical re-examination of the politics of memory and the representational strategies, commemoration, rituals of remembrance, museums, sites of memories they entail in Latin America. I will wrap up right now. One last thing, linking the 2 previous contentions I've made. All this, in my understanding, means that we should try to engage in ways of re-signifying the term genocide, okay, from the perspective of historians and possibly sociologists and anthropologists, with greater precision and analytical rigor. And this would require breaking with both the legal approach and the moralism it has entailed using the term genocide. Such a reinterpretation of the word genocide, breaking away from or decoupling the legal approach and its moral implications, would at least entail, 1, breaking with the descriptive approaches, which have been mentioned many times, this seminar, that are almost always static and teleological. We're talking about that. We know how a process ended, so we must find out how it begins. Thus, we go in search, that is the trap of the historians, and it's very difficult to resist a teleological story or narrative from that perspective. Second, we would need to adopt a perspective that sees genocide, and I'm not saying this is not being done. I'm saying this is still, from my understanding, not dominant enough. That sees genocide as a specific dynamic of violence, a contingent, open process that changes or evolves over time, which has been mentioned, which means that not every process that begins with mass deportation or purges of population or state repression ends up in genocide. The open-endedness, the simultaneous sort of events that are occurring at the same time, I think is very important. We need to propose a broader concept of destruction that includes not only mass murder, but other forms of physical and social destruction. This has been mentioned today also. And finally, a conception that posits, and this has been done by several historians, that the criteria of destruction of the civilian population in the process of genocide and other processes of mass violence are defined by the perpetrators. I don't think we need to engage in this endless debate about the groups, when it is always the perpetrator who defines who he wants to destroy and how. So, in concluding, the study of extreme violence must analyze the complexity of the processes of violence, the political and social logic that they articulate, the meaning of the events, and the ethical and political effects they have. To do so, this implies a critical analysis of the effects of the globalization of the memory of the Holocaust as a paradigm that has defined the horrors and social catastrophes of this century, which, as I argue, have been paradoxical at least. Finally, examining the effects of this paradigm must be, as I said, linked to the decoupling of legalism and moralism in the study of extreme violence, so that we can try to avoid the political instrumentalization of memory under the all-encompassing shadow of the Holocaust. But, moreover, I would try to provoke a discussion here. Little people dedicate their lives to genocide studies, and argue that to achieve a more rigorous conceptual framework that enhances our understanding of the diverse processes compromised by the phenomena of extreme violence, it might be necessary, as Mark Mauserwerk has implied, Snyder said this morning, to jettison genocide, the legal category of genocide, as a category of historical analysis. As we are all aware, mass violence remains one of the most crucial problems of our time. It is a challenge that requires that we rethink our theoretical and conceptual framework and their ethical and political implications.
I'm going to try to project my words so we don't have to go to the mic. Our next presenter is Joachim Savelsberg, I cannot say it, I'm sorry. He's a professor of sociology and law and Ashram and Charlotte Ochanisi Chair at the University of Minnesota. Some of his recent publications include Representing Mass Violence, Conflicting Responses to Human Rights Violations in Darfur, Representing Human Rights Violations in Darfur, Global Justice, National Distinctions with Colonized Grant, that's coming out in the American Journal of Sociology, and American Memories, Atrocities, and the Law by Arthur King. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Erna. Thank you all for being here. I've learned a lot already, and I will learn more as we proceed. The title, again, is Comparative Genocide Studies in the Holocaust. Holocaust. So there's the word comparison. And I want to propose that there are different ways of talking about comparison. There is an analytic way of talking about comparison. Social science is always a comparative enterprise. Even when we deal with singular case studies, there's always an implicit comparison at work. So it's an analytic tool without which we would not achieve very much in the sciences. You can also talk about comparison in terms of religious ethics. We can think of events as sacred or as sacred evil, that they are surrounded by taboos, and we cannot easily compare them with other events. And in Germany, a notion that is associated strongly with the Holocaust, maybe in Israel also. There's a taboo surrounding the theme, and engaging an analytic comparison of that event with other genocides is not easy to do. Then there's a third way of talking about comparison, which reflects my own work. And this is comparing or classifying as an everyday practice. This is if you want, a sociology of knowledge exercise. Of course, also within scholarship. Scholarship is also an everyday practice, even though it follows particular rules. We can think about classifications in which scholars engage, and we can study them, and it is a sociology of scientific knowledge study. So this is one way, three ways of thinking about comparison, and I place myself in the third category, or my work, I should say. There is another distinction I want to make. When we talk about classifications, we have to think about classificatory schemes, and we can think about the genesis of classification schemes, and this is a long history in sociology with the work of Emil Durkheim and Marcel Mauss, who thought about how do humans categorize the social world, how do these categories emerge, how do they reflect the society, the social structures in which humans exist. And of course, in our realm, where we deal with categories such as genocides, or crimes against humanity, or atrocity crimes, these are new, historically speaking, very new categories. So we can talk about the generation of this classificatory scheme, where maybe the genus might be atrocity crimes, and the species might be crimes against humanity or genocide. That's not what I do, even though there are scholars who are engaging exactly with this. What I do is placing events in, or asking how specific events are placed within these now existent classification schemes by everyday actors who operate in different social fields and who operate in different national contexts. And I already mentioned Israel and Germany a moment ago, where there are particular criteria. So we call something genocide, or we don't call it genocide. Or we go more extreme and link a genocide event through analogical bridging to the Holocaust. Or we don't do that. And if we do, and who does, under what conditions, that is what I am interested in. So the project I'm engaged in is really a sociology of knowledge project. And I want to use the term knowledge not in the psychological sense, as a cognitive category, but I adapt here a definition from the literature on collective memory, just applied to contemporary knowledge. Knowledge is assumptions about the world that are shared, that are mutually acknowledged, and that are reinforced by a collectivity. This may be a demographic group, this may be an institution such as a court. So this is an interesting definition because it tells us that knowing already involves a social process in which negotiation takes place, in which we encourage the other to continue along a line of thought, or disrupt the other and tell him or her, no, don't tell me more about this, I do not want to hear about it. So denial and acknowledgement are already part of the knowledge construction process. Once knowledge is established in a collectivity, other collectivities may go about to decide to deny that which one group of people has established as their knowledge. So these are the kinds of questions I explore in my in my work, and I want to give you a couple of empirical illustrations on how I do this. And the first is the case of Darfur, an empirical study of 8 countries. And Holly Nice-Brame, whom we heard present beautifully a moment ago, was the lead research assistant when she was still a graduate student here in Minnesota in this project. I'm eternally grateful to Holly for what she did then. In this project, I conducted interviews in different social fields in these 8 countries, in a humanitarian aid NGO, Doctors Without Borders, in a human rights NGO, Amnesty International, in foreign ministries, with Darfur and Sudan experts, and with Africa correspondents who had written articles in leading newspapers. The second component was indeed a more quantitative statistical study, was a content analysis of 3,000 plus media reports published in leading newspapers in these 8 countries. And that's where Holly made very major contributions. Out of this came a book representing mass violence, which, by the way, may I mention, because I don't earn any money from it, is also available as an online open access publication, University of California Press, but also the article in the American Journal of Sociology that Holly and I co-authored. What I found fascinating in the interviews I conducted is that I was confronted with people who constructed the reality of Darfur in very different ways. I talked to human rights activists at Amnesty. They were very generous in applying the term state crime to the violence in Darfur. I talked to people in foreign ministries who were very reluctant, certainly to use the term genocide, very reluctant even to describe what occurred in Darfur as state crime. When I talked to people in humanitarian aid organizations, they're very reluctant to categorize the violence in Darfur as crime. Why these differences in representations? Why these differences in talking about the reality of Darfur, in categorizing the event? Because of the nature of the social field in which these actors were embedded. The country of Sudan, its government, was a major player in the diplomatic field, for example. This was shortly before the comprehensive peace agreement between the North and the South was come to bear, and the diplomats were terrified that 10 years of hard diplomatic work would be destroyed if they defined the government of Sudan as criminals, as genocidaires. Similar with the humanitarian aid organizations who depend on collaboration with the Sudanese government in order to get travel permits to get their aid on the ground. Very cautious in categorizing the violence as a case of genocide or even as a case of state criminal violence. So the nature of the social field really makes an important difference. Interesting in the media analysis, I'm going to show this only briefly. For interest is that when we look at the different frames, and often they are cited in the media reports, that the crime frame is cited most frequently, followed by the civil war, armed conflict frame, followed by a humanitarian emergency frame. We could talk about why the receptivity for a crime frame in the media is highest, and it varies from country to country, as does the use of the term genocide in media reports. This very simple diagram shows that this is the percentage of articles that cite the term genocide when describing Darfur. You can see that the likelihood that Darfur is described as a genocide varies from country to country. It is particularly high in the United States, and it is much lower in countries such as Germany or Ireland. Also, analogical bridging is practiced in very different ways across the countries. In the United States, it is applied generously in frequency of analogical bridging to the Holocaust, but also in its explicit nature. Niklas Christoph particularly writes, for example, on Sudan's final solution or on Africa's brutal Lebensraum. If I would read from these op-ed pieces, you would see very, very direct references saying, when we want to understand Darfur, we need to look at the Holocaust, and we need to use the Holocaust to shine light on Darfur in order to make appropriate sense of that event that so far we have not fully understood. In Germany, great caution. A quotation from one article in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, here something is compared with that which is synonymous with the incomparable. There is a refusal to compare, there's a refusal certainly to engage in analogical bridging to the Holocaust, very different in the United States. It was fascinating for me to ask why, and this is when the interviews came to bear in order to make sense of the quantitative patterns that we had identified together with Holly. The interviews showed that in the United States, the carrier groups who proposed a genocide frame, African Americans, the Black Caucus in the US Congress was very active in promoting the genocide frame. The US Holocaust Memorial Museum was very active, issued a genocide alert on Darfur. Ireland, a very different story. Ireland is a country which, in light of its experience of famine and extreme poverty, is engaged in its foreign policy, particularly in the realm of humanitarian aid. So just like humanitarian aid agencies, Irish respondents and media reporters were very reluctant to use the term genocide or to frame the violence as a form of criminal violence. Germany is always a complicated case. I was astonished initially that the term genocide was used more rarely in German media reports. I thought in the light of German history that there would be a particular awareness and a particular willingness to engage with the notion of genocide. And here again, the interviews came in very handy. An Africa correspondent of the Süddeutsche Zeitung, when I asked him, does it matter that you report about Darfur as a German? This was a man who was a couple of decades younger than me. Initially said, no, I don't think so. And then he corrected himself and said, well, if I think about it, maybe it does, because when I think about Völkermord, genocide, I place the Holocaust underneath that category. And once I've done that, no matter how horrible things were in Darfur, I've seen them, I have a hard time placing Darfur within the same category. Another respondent, director of one of the major Holocaust memorial sites in Germany, a reformed rabbi, the son of an Auschwitz survivor. When I asked him, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum has a dual mission to commemorate, but also to alert the world. Why don't I see this so much in German Holocaust memorial sites? And the answer was, and this man is certainly beyond suspicion, the answer was, the Americans can do this. If we as Germans do so, we will be accused of trying to relativize the Holocaust. This is a theme that appeared in many conversations, and they are very. But the point here is that there are different cultural sensitivities in different national contexts, and we cannot understand the way in which events are categorized in these categorical schemes that have been developed over the past 100 years without taking these cultural sensitivities, policy preferences, and a number of other things into consideration, just like we need to understand the structure of social fields in order to understand how actors within different social fields categorize events in different ways. I have a couple of additional slides. I think since I was told 2 minutes ago that my time was up, and since I'm one of the organizers and a good example, I will skip them. Let me show. This is about the Armenian genocide. This is from a website of an Armenian, French-Armenian activist group about categorizing denialist events. We are currently conducting an analysis of these events, but here's just a timeline of the frequency of denialist events in which the Turkish state and French-Turkish groups play a central role. It is interesting for me how, in response to such categorical denial, the effort of trying to get an event categorized as genocide and the intensity of bridging to the Holocaust really come to bear, and conducting an analysis of legislation in France, legislation first to categorize the genocide as a genocide and then to criminalize the denial of that genocide. But we also conducting a content analysis of documentary films, and maybe I just list the titles of three. Secret Histories, The Hidden Holocaust, a film from 1992. Caves into which, quote, were tipped literally thousands of women and children, end quote, referring to a, quote, subterranean Auschwitz. The numbers are always the minutes and seconds in the film where these statements are made. The scene of the century's first Holocaust, the Turkish denial, quote, in some way identical to denial of neo-Nazis when they say that, quote, Nazi Holocaust against Jews never happened. And I could talk about other films. So I think there are two lessons. Number one, that knowledge, the everyday practice of crime and genocide classification and of analogical bridging varies across social fields, it varies across national context. And I think we also have the insight that the staunch denial in the age of what Catherine Sicking has called the justice cascade provokes social mobilization and an intense effort at analogical bridging to the Holocaust. At least that seems to be indicated by the Armenian case. This is a little bit about my conceptual concerns about my empirical work. Thank you very much for your attention.
And now we will hear a paper by Alejandro Black. Alejandro is Associate Professor in Sociology and Director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota. After completing his PhD at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, he held positions at universities in Madrid, Beirut, and Munich. He has authored numerous books and articles addressing issues of genocide, collective memory, and anti-Semitism, with a particular focus on Spain and the Spanish-speaking world. His most recent book, co-authored in 1990, is titled Memory and Forgetting in the Post-Holocaust Era, The Ethics of Never Again.
Thank you very much. Dr. Erman Ecevich, who presented the defense United States research. Congratulations. Thank you all. Thank you to our guests, students, faculty. I would like to present on the cases of Spain and Argentina. I will focus today specifically on Argentina. With a short time frame, and I've titled this Notes on Scholarship, Transitional Justice and Memory Politics. It's an attempt to see the connecting threads, trying to highlight the common features that I see in these transitional justice processes or post-transitional justice processes in Spain and Argentina when the interpretative frame of the Holocaust and genocide is being increasingly adopted. So my interest, we're talking about these two cases. We're talking about Spain civil war, we're talking about Francoist violence, Francoist crimes from 36 to 39 and 39-75 during the dictatorship, and the Argentinian state terror. Of course, the issue of how we define it, that's the question of the issue of the presentation. Between 76 and 83. So the questions that I'm trying to find responses for is, what are the origins of and what are the societal conditions of the adoption of the Holocaust and genocide frame in both countries, Argentina and in Spain? How do these frames affect contemporary memory and transitional justice politics? And in this sense, I think also of transitional justice not only in terms of trials and prosecution, accountability, but also transitional processes that involve the goals, or that try to reach the goals of peace, stable democracy, and reconciliation among former enemies. So how do these frames affect collective actions and group identities? And do these frames enable or rather hamper in the process of coming to terms with these specific episodes of mass violence? And finally, and I'll devote a little more time on that, what role does Holocaust and genocide scholarship play as a condition or as a consequence of such framing? So I'm interested in the linkages, in the transferences between the scholarly and the broader political, advocate, legal agendas in Spain and Argentina. And if we look at when this all started, and now we're looking at Argentina, it is specifically the Nunca Más Truth Commission report of 1984, which has shaped in a fundamental way the collective memory of this period and the crimes of this period. And the Holocaust as a subtext in the shaping of the collective memory of the period of the military dictatorship can be traced back to this Truth Commission report that was titled Nunca Más. And the title of the report was chosen after one of the commissioners had seen the phrase written in several languages, as you see in the picture there, on the monument at the Dachau concentration camp in Germany. But so we have here an analogical bridging, but more importantly is that what hovers over the Argentine events is the Holocaust as the paradigmatic never again, which relies on an unambiguous separation between victims and perpetrators. And here's also the problem that I see and try to shed light on. The Truth Commission report establishes at the narrative level the figure of the desaparecido, the disappeared, as an innocent victim of state terror. And Emilio Grenzel, Argentine sociologist, has written in a book on the report. He pointed out that the distinctive feature of the desaparecidos, the disappearances, is found in the report in the shaping of the humanitarian narrative that omitted the victims' political predicaments and avoided encoding, historizing the causes of the political violence. So the report provides the symbolic and the factual foundation for the subsequent trial of the military officers in 1985, whom it denies all legitimation of an ex post facto justification of the coup that would frame the events as features of a civil war, which was the narrative adopted by the military regime. But I want to underline this, that the report and the figure of the desaparecido is based on this sharp moral contrast between innocent victims and abusive state authorities. Of course, from a legal perspective, these were victims because they were victims of a criminal state that did not protect their rights. But it's important to say that the majority of disappeared belonged to left-leaning opposition groups, labor unions, front organizations of the guerrilla forces. And this is not what the report says. Here is the original prologue of the report. It's a view of complete vulnerability. Anyone, however innocent, might become a victim of this never-ending witch. So, in another sense, somehow it is. I mean, this is. I'll go a bit faster. I will talk now about this Holocaust metaphors and the language described, and Carlos Pavón has touched on that already, to describe the events in Argentina, which has been very common for human rights activists, for writers, for filmmakers, for victims themselves, which make use of these analogies, of these metaphors, of these tropes of iconography in artist work, in their accounts of the period. But very important also to say that when we talk about analogical bridging, as Joachim has just said, that we are talking of different forms of analogical bridging. One is at the level of the events, where and that's mostly scholars try to find similarity, connecting threads between historical episodes, but the other is at the level of the possibility of representation itself. So somehow the Holocaust is a cultural template that hinges very much on theoretical, artistic debate regarding the impossibility of representation. So we have a large number of initiatives in the field of the arts, in public memorials. I'm going to show some of the analogies. Well, this is quite straightforward analysis. This is the front cover of the Nunca Más report, that was published by the daily Página 12 20 years after the coup in 1996, which directly what you see the Casa Rosada, the president's house, Rivera, and the military junta, juxtaposed with images of Hitler, of Nazism, or Nazi symbols. This is another interesting example where we see, this is a work by artist Marcelo Brodsky. Some of you might know this memorial plaque in installation in Berlin. So one lists concentration and extermination camps in, these are all in Eastern Europe, Germany and Eastern Europe, the Holocaust, and then the clandestine detention centers in Argentina. And this is in front of the most famous of those clandestine detention centers, which is the Escuela Superior Mecánica de la Armada in Buenos Aires. The Stolperstein project, which is also interesting, the Baldosas por la Memoria, Tides of Memory. So I would say these analogical practices that you find making that, adopting the Holocaust frame. Argentina is also probably the country in Latin America, I would say it's a country in Latin America where Holocaust historiography, political theory, social theory, the artistic debates around the Holocaust have been most widely translated. And not only that, it is being taught at universities and it's critically interpreted with significant local Argentinian contribution. So there has been, I would say, since early on, since the mid-80s, continuous dialogue and continuous engagement by Argentinian intellectuals with the scholarly production in all disciplines pertaining to the Holocaust. Now the question is why, and why Argentina? And I would say so much more than Uruguay, definitely more than Chile. You have some examples in Brazil. You have the Brazil nunca mais, the nunca más report. You have some analysis, but compared to Argentina, it's just incredibly more salient to the adoption of this frame. So we could list a few reasons for it. We decided on this 10 time. So, okay. So a few reasons for that. Significantly higher number of Jewish population than in those other Latin American countries. Or I would say population of Jewish origin. Significant number among the disappeared of individuals of Jewish origin. The fact that Jewish intellectuals, journalists, artists, scholars took an active role in the human rights movement in the 80s and 90s and continue to be very involved and active in that context. The role of Jewish human rights movement in the 80s. And of course also the fact that what was the role that the Nazi crimes played for the perpetrators themselves. So here, this is this knowledge of other history, and this is the work by Federico Finkelstein, who's really interesting. He says that their action of the perpetrators became an active memory of Auschwitz. So the fact, I would say it's more of an ideological affinity, anti-Semitism among the Argentinians. But way behind here, so let me focus on the question of genocide in Argentina. And here, again, there is a specific Argentinian generalization of the term genocide as a category to describe the crimes of the junta. We do not find that in other countries. And other countries have similar processes, historical process of counter-insurgent terror strategies that targeted civil population. So applying the genocide term to the crimes of the junta appears to consolidate further the Holocaust analogy and the innocent victim narrative that the Nunca Más report and the trial of the juntas initiated. However, it also complicates the same paradigm. In the Nunca Más report, as we have seen, the disappeared are remembered solely as victims without a history, without agency, abstract human beings, and citizens whose rights were violated by a terrorist state. Now, in order to qualify as victims of genocide, they must necessarily be seen as members of a distinct group that was targeted for destruction. And here is where the work of Argentinian genocide scholars comes in, and many of you know Daniel Firestein. Now, so genocide scholarship closes this gap and provides somehow the theoretical foundation for the genocide claim. And this is not only a scholarly debate, since the genocide claim has also led to judicial interventions. How is this argument made? That those targeted by the criminal actions of the juntas during the dictatorship had all participated in the social movements of that time. That's Daniel Firestein. And thus it is the thoughts, the beliefs, the actions of victims that have made them into a group in the eyes of the perpetrators and thus into victims of genocide. So it's this particular way of living, I quote Firestein, that made the victims part of a real or imaginary group and prey to the repressor. The question here is that, going back to what Barb said this morning, that you can understand from how advocates and lawyers try to fit their cases into the definition of genocide. Now here we have an interesting case where we have this clear attempt to fit into the definition of genocide, altering it partially, the Argentinian case. He also, Firestein also introduces the concept of reorganizing genocide, which has the concentration camp as its central tool of operation, and it seeks to reshape social relationships by means of terror, inspired by the work of Lemkin. And the critique that can be leveled against that is on the fact that these particular ways of living, and you don't see that only for the Argentinian case, these ways of living, quoting Firestein, that constitute group membership, are informed by decisions, in most cases, of adult autonomous individuals, rather than being only the expression of the contingencies of birth interpreted by perpetrators' classification. But, and there are other critiques that you could say, depending on what is the definition of genocide that you use. I wanted to point to the Echecolat's case, maybe later in the Q&A, genocide scholars serving as testigos de concepto, witnesses of concepts in trials. And in the Echecolat's case, this is the outcome of this is the court verdict. And I would say that this is an intervention that is informed directly by genocide scholarship, which is definitely an interesting development here. I want to point out also, I'm almost wrapping up. I want to point to the polysemy of the concept of genocide among human rights advocates, but also among scholars. There is no consensus whether this constitutes genocide or not. I developed these different positions on that. And are we talking here about local meanings of the term genocide? Like presented this morning. Concluding, and I want to pick up an idea from Philip this morning. You talked about certain Holocaust-centered projects, research projects like the Wiener Library, documentation projects, and memorial projects. And you say it has helped us, this is what victims of other atrocities say, to understand and commemorate what happened to us. Now I would push back on the fact that we use understand and commemorate in the same phrase. Because this is also the problem that I come across both in Spain and Argentina when the Holocaust and genocide frames are adopted. And there's no doubt that it has provided a powerful tool for human rights movements in both countries. And it has raised the awareness of the severity of the crimes that were committed. And in this new light, it expels, you might say, any remaining legitimations of the violence. It expels it to the political margin. But at the same time, looking, revisiting, reframing the events through this prism creates very significant blind spots. And as from the perspective of scholarship, these blind spots, I didn't have time to come to the issue of transitional justice, maybe we can do it in Q&A, but these blind spots are actually forgettings in memory narratives. We have hegemonic narrative, but we have these areas of shade, these blind spots that are just don't receive sufficient attention. What are the societal consequences of these blind spots? And I leave it here, so I'm taking a little bit more time. Thank you for your attention.
Before we go into the Q&A, we have a few graduate students that will present their briefly present their current dissertation project. So I'd like to call Paula first. Paula Cuellar is a PhD candidate in history with a graduate minor in human rights. Paula was the 2014-2015 Bazin Fellow in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She is currently the USC Shoah 2016-2017 Graduate Research Fellow, a 2016-2017 American Association of University Women International Fellow, and University of Minnesota Interdisciplinary Doctoral Fellow. Paula is interested in the question of genocide in Central America. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi. Nice to see you all here. I'm a little bit nervous, and I have just 5 minutes to present, so I'll try to be brief. My investigation focuses on sport tourist operations as genocidal practices per se. So first, I would like to talk about what sport tourist operations are. And sport tourist operations constitute a particular way of military tactics in which armed forces go up into the countryside and kill the people, kill the animals, destroy the houses, destroy the crops. So basically, they constitute military tactics which aim to annihilate all means of livelihood. They constitute counterinsurgency tactics who are based in the expression of taking the water away from the fish. Just in terms of taking all the means of livelihood to support the guerrilla forces. These counterinsurgency tactics are based on the national security doctrine of that time that was basically on the Reagan era of that time, and negates the importance of individual rights of that time, and defines entire classes of people as threat to the security of the nations. That situation imposes a false dichotomy between an in-group and an out-group, which constitutes a pre-situation for genocide, and it basically establishes a separation between an us and them in the country. And my study is a comparison between sport tourist operations in Guatemala and El Salvador. In both countries there were armed conflict, very bloody armed conflict, one which lasted in Guatemala almost 36 years, in El Salvador more than 12 years. And in both cases, these sport tourist operations took place in the early years of the 80s. And my study basically attempts to move the focus of study from traditional places of genocide and tries to take it to Latin America, basically to Central America, which is an understudied kind of place. And in Guatemala, these particular military tactics have been labeled as genocidal practices because they were aimed at the Maya population. So it's a group protected under the legal definition, under the convention, under the Genocide Convention, because we know that there are 4 groups protected under the Genocide Convention. But in El Salvador, these same practices, these exactly same practices, have not been deemed as genocidal because they were aimed basically at poor peasants, which were economic and social groups. At most, they were aimed at political groups, if defined by the minds of the perpetrators, because they were deemed by the armed forces as part of the guerrilla movement. So they are totally excluded from the definition, the legal definition of genocide. So what I propose basically in my study is an objective definition of some practices, such as sport tourist operation as genocidal practices per se, independent of the groups that are being protected under the Genocide Convention. Thank you so much.
And next student I'd like to call is Susie McElrath. She's a doctoral candidate in sociology at the University of Minnesota. she's interested in comparative and historical perspective. Oh, sorry, I should reread that again. Comparative and historical perspective shaped her research on the causes of and responses to mass atrocities and gender-based violence. So the dissertation analyzes the political and social processes affecting why and how countries have incorporated international crimes into domestic law since World War II.
So I must admit the previous conversations about jettisoning, decoupling the legal definition of genocide from an analytic definition it falls right in line with what I'm going to say, I guess, but also it makes me a little bit nervous to speak to you all about the definitions of genocide under law. So the first thing that I'd like to say is that typically when we discuss the definition of genocide, we refer to this international definition underneath the UN Genocide Convention, right? And we refer to it offhand as the one and only, right? So my research analyzes the incorporation of international crimes, particularly genocide, into domestic law. And other scholars have looked at adopting the Genocide Convention, but no one has systematically analyzed the ways that genocide laws are transformed, how the content of those laws change in many cases when adopted into domestic law. So studying domestic laws, why do that? Well, for several reasons, but I'll state just two here. First, from a policy perspective, the vast majority of atrocity crimes cases have been and will likely continue to be tried under national judicial systems. And unlike some other types of treaties, the Genocide Convention does not have force of law without further domestic legal action. It requires an implementation procedure, in particular to establish punishment for it. That was set out in the treaty itself, that at the domestic level, punishment needs to be prescribed. And second, we focus on law, myself as a sociologist, because I know that law is both representative of culture, as filtered through legal and political institutions, of course, but it is also constitutive, so it shapes our memories of past events. So when we've all been talking about genocide and thinking about the ways that this international definition shapes how we, even as scholars, think about what it is to be genocide, what something is to construct it as genocide. I'd like to take that then to the next step to see how our construction or our conception of genocide changes once we get into the domestic realm. So again, I'll agree with what Carlos said earlier. There isn't just one conception of what genocide is. And in fact, it's not just this distinction between analytical definitions and legal definitions. Within the law itself, genocide has been interpreted in many ways within the domestic law. Okay, so in the 1 to 2 minutes that I have left here, I'll describe my study. So I collected national legislation, statutory acts, and criminal codes that provide for criminal punishment of genocide from all current and former members of the United Nations. And while I'm interested in what the practical effects of current laws are for policy reasons, I'm also interested in the construction of these laws. So what are the origins? So I traced back in history to the moments when these laws were first adopted into national law. To date, I have uncovered 126 laws, domestic laws, while 147 countries have adopted the Genocide Convention. So quickly, I'll just say, focus on just one of my findings here, looking at the status groups that are protected, as we've talked about, and as Dr. Weitz was saying about the expansion, or how the definition is both too broad and too narrow. Within status groups, countries have taken quite a bit of liberty when constructing them in their national laws. So 1/3 of all countries of the laws that I have quoted have changed the status groups. Most of them have expanded the categories to include political groups, which makes sense. That was political groups is the category that's been most talked about, was debated at the time of the Genocide Convention. But interestingly, also social groups, and the argument being made, it seems, is that maybe we shouldn't have these set status groups, that as perpetrators are the ones who are defining groups as we go, that this idea that a social group, quote, as arbitrarily defined in certain cases, that's been used in some laws, or a meaningful social group as such, something like that, right? So to very much broaden up the cases that can be included under genocide in those national judicial systems. Okay, so I'll say just to wrap up real quickly, that when we think about genocide and the effects of genocide, and whether or not cases like Argentina, in fact, meet this definition or not, that sometimes at the domestic level, and depending on what jurisdiction, it could be considered genocide, a legal finding of that, and that legal findings have real effects. They find their ways into media accounts more often than other kinds of stories. They find their way into textbooks, as Joachimsberg has shown. Legal decisions shape our collective memory of what these events are. And so as these domestic laws are broadening these concepts, it's going to change, I believe, the types of things that maybe not for academics, but very much for the public, expand the idea of what they think of as genocide.
And last but not least, we have Wahutu Seguru. He's a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Minnesota. Wahutu's research interests are in sociology of media, genocide, mass violence, and atrocity, specifically on issues of representation of conflicts in Africa, such as Darfur and Rwanda. Collective memory, and perhaps somewhat tangentially, democracy and development in Africa.
Hi everyone. Sorry I'm battling a really nasty cold, so if I sound clogged up, that's what's happening. And this is why I needed slides, just to keep me honest. First off, I have a very scholarly sociological title, right? Long thing, column. But what I'm looking for specifically, what I'm looking at is how Africans learn about genocides and mass atrocities happening in other African countries, primarily through the press. So to Bob's earlier question, yes, the media is important. I have to say that because I'm looking for jobs this year, I have to justify why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Oh, she's Spanish.
Terrible. But a couple of observations for my dissertation research. One is this 99 citation, right, that says a majority of African countries get their images of other African countries from a handful of Western-based news agencies. So part of my interest here was what is happening now that we've moved into 2000, right? Now that we have this technology, now that one of the largest media organizations in East and Central Africa is in Nairobi. That's kind of the other motivation was this quote by everybody's favorite Hollywood actor, where he says, "I'm here today to represent the voices of the people who cannot speak for themselves. At the time we're here today, more women and children will die violently in the Darfur region than in Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, Israel, or Lebanon." So this notion of speaking for people, this notion of speaking for Africans was me very personal because I'm African, and I've always believed that we have a voice to say what we need to say, but also why? What is this motivation to speak for Africans? So, in the last one, my dissertation essentially looks at the production of knowledge, right, about genocides and mass murder by media fields in African countries and in the global north. Specifically, I looked at Darfur. The dissertation in and of itself seeks to answer the following research questions. One, does the representation of mass atrocity vary by region or nation? And the reason why this was important is I was interested to see whether Kenyans talk about and frame Darfur, which is right next door, in a different way when compared to South Africans or Rwandans that went through a genocide or Nigeria that has a north and south split, or Egypt that has had a very long history with Sudan. Right? So the notion of the difference by region then becomes that much more important, because each country has a very specific history that is unique to it in relation to Darfur, but in relation to genocide, right? In Rwanda that went through it, but in all of these other countries that provided troops for peacekeeping missions in some of these conflicts. What I'm going to talk about today briefly is the last bit, who is anointed as a credible source of knowledge by journalists, right? So here I'm thinking of the sources, the George Clooney's who need to talk for Africans, right? Who are those people and why? And this is where I answer Bob's question, because I think when we study media, especially in the global south, the approach has been somewhat flawed, because we assume that just because a news organization publishes a report, that kind of represents the Mexican take of what is happening, or the Kenyan take of what is happening in Darfur. My argument is we need to somewhat focus on a different analytical category, and this is the use of violence. The use of violence becomes important because when you look at how African newspapers or Kenyan newspapers represented Darfur, the primary frame, writ large, was the crime frame, right? So it is one would assume Kenyans largely represented Darfur as a crime. But if you look at the violence, you quickly realize, as a civil war frame, civil war. If you look at the violence, you quickly realize that Kenyan journalists that live and reside in Kenya that have traveled to Darfur view Darfur as a crime, and not as a civil war. It's a crime first and foremost, then a civil war. If you look at how Y organizations framed Darfur, they looked at it as a civil war, right? But because of the preponderance of Y organization stories in these particular newspapers, the overarching frame in Kenya then seems to be as though it's a civil war frame, right? Which, what I argue is that then doesn't tell us much. So perhaps in that particular question, it becomes much more important to understand how Mexican journalists tell these stories to their Mexican audiences, and then compare that to how Y agencies talk about these things. So, and also a couple of key findings. One is that the largest media fields in Africa both prefer to lift the stories from Y agencies, right? So the largest media fields there being the Kenyan one in East Africa and the South African one. And by largest here I mean that media fields that have been around for a long time and that are much more robust than neighboring media fields, right? And they prefer to use Y agencies even when they send their journalists to Darfur. And that was perhaps often the most frustrating thing for most of these journalists, because they went to these places, they knew these people, but it was the George Clooney's that were telling the story. From a post-colonial period perspective, the critique has always been Western media stereotypes Africa, right? Western media has this colonial trope. What I'm finding in my work is that in African countries, in these particular countries, even the Y agencies gave preference to Sudanese sources to tell the story of Darfur. When we quibble about the morality of this, because these Sudanese sources are being accused of perpetrating a genocide, but those voices are key. The key difference then becomes the next large group of sources were often American sources and English sources. This is the same even when we use violence. So Kenyan journalists were much more likely to favor American voices over Kenyan voices. And people often go, oh yeah, but it's about capacity, but well, no, it is cheaper to cite a Kenyan source in Nairobi than it is to cite some senator from whatever, right? And I ended up knowing these senators by names because they were always showing up in these reports, even by Kenyan journalists. So what I'm finding is that when you look at news organizations and look at stories by violence, we're finding that Kenyan journalists, African news organizations are in the periphery of the global narrative construction about atrocities in Africa, right? They push themselves, in a very big way, they push themselves to the periphery by the decisions they make as to who they're going to quote. But African journalists who critique this stereotypical representation of Africa, who critique the silencing of African voices, are also wanting to silence these very same voices. they're not citing their voices from their countries. So they're giving a benefit to the Americans and the Europeans to tell the story of Darfur to their Kenyan audiences. So that's one of the findings for this particular chapter. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. We have just about 35 minutes to discuss. I will, based on having read the articles and heard the presentations, I will formulate some of my questions and then we can build into a discussion. Given that these three presentations that we saw today have such a Does it work? Yeah. Okay. It's going to be easier to talk. Given that all three presentations have had such a focus on the different social actors, and a little bit going back to the keynote speech last night, I would like to sort of emphasize not all social actors, but also us as social actors, us as scholars, because Timothy Snyder, it was interesting to me that he said he didn't use the word genocide in his work on Armenia on purpose, because it causes so many misunderstandings among scholars and these discussions, which we've seen in these presentations as well. But he also alluded that there's a certain responsibility that scholars, just like activists and everybody else involved, all the other social actors, have to appraise and evaluate different types of mass violence and put that into dialogue. So with that in mind, I would like to hear more from the panelists on how might we approach evaluating and understanding mass violence in terms of the word genocide, which is the biggest problem, I think, in these countries. Whether we avoid it or not. Should we avoid it? Should we not avoid it? How do we precisely step outside of this paradigm, as Carlos Pavlov suggested? We have to be more precise and kind of step outside the legal and moralistic framework. My second question kind of goes into this idea, what was mentioned, that there's this kind of competition of suffering, right? Who gets to say they were a victim, or who gets to say that they were suffering of a genocide, and then comparing that to the Holocaust. So if it's sort of a competition of suffering, how can we provide a language to discuss and not fall into anti-Semitic terms, right? To use the Holocaust when necessary as a model, but also to step further when we need to. And this came about in a class discussion in the Spanish department. We were discussing the Spanish Civil War, and we were using the Holocaust as a frame. And then some students said, well, I don't want to sound anti-Semitic by saying, well, not everything can apply, and the Holocaust can't be held as this ultimate genocide. So another thing that I'm going to throw out. And finally, inspired precisely by this idea of what Alejandro was saying, that there are these blind spots that get created because of the limitations of this model of globalized Holocaust memory. And I guess I would like to hear more about what you all think about the creation of these blind spots and how do we deal with it.
You want to start?
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the papers. Just all of this. Sure. I'm going to sort of mix your questions. Address three things. My paper's title is Genocide, with quotation marks. What is in a name? And our panel has to do with politics and naming. It has to do with language and categories. I mentioned in the paper, and what I spoke, who gets to name what is a genocide and the competition of suffering between victims. And that is one dimension of the politics of naming. We could call it symbolic violence this morning, or whatever. It has to do with trying to achieve moral and political authority and recognition. As I said, because the way the legal category frames genocide, it's not, genocide is anything that's awful, horrible, that involves mass atrocity. So if what happened to my people is not genocide, it's trivialized. Okay. But there's also a politics of naming that has to do with other actors, the states. Why did the U.S., because it's interesting, the empirical research, but the case is that the U.S. jumped immediately in the United Nations and named that what the ongoing process in Darfur was genocide before anybody. And China was in the forefront of saying, no, it's not genocide. And the African Union said, well, it doesn't, right now it's not. Maybe later it will be when they kill everybody, but not this moment. So those actors also have the realpolitik, politics of naming. And it matters. And it matters decisively what is named and what is not named. Why did Obama dance around in 2015 not naming the Armenian atrocities as genocide? I mean, it was all over the press how he danced around with all his eloquence, but he could never pronounce the word genocide in relation to Armenia. The Pope, who's Argentinian, immediately said it was genocide. So there's a politics of naming that has to do with power, and power struggles, and unequal distribution of power between actors. So that's one thing. The second, the language issue. I'm following basically the French researcher Jacques Semery, who's author of the book Historian Purified, the Political Uses of Massacre. And he very specifically proposes a possible way out. He says the intersection from the inception of genocide, the Genocide Convention, between the normative framework of the law and the social science approach has hindered the study and the way he understands it. So he proposes that the first step, it's not a solution to a complex problem, but the first step is to abandon the normative language categories. I mean, as a historian, and I guess as a sociologist, as an anthropologist, which I'm not, but there are related fields, I find it very difficult to engage in a historiography whose vocabulary and categories is normative. I mean, it is counterintuitive for me. It does not lend itself to the autonomy of understanding complexity, because you have to frame and sort of box in your analysis to a legal category. I teach a course which is on 20th century history, and it focuses on extreme violence. And I try to provide nuance and try to be rigorous and try to explain that it's very difficult, but that if all we're going to say about the violence that was horrible, the class could end the first day. And I say, let's state that everything we're going to discuss in this course is terrible and horrible. But we have to study it, and we have to make distinctions, and we have to provide comparisons without parity. And I tried that very, very strongly. And at the end of each case, and I begin with Armenia, and I go through the 20th century, and every case, at the end of the discussion, the students want to know one thing and only one thing. But professor, was it or was it not genocide? That's all that matters for them at the end. Because it's really internalized, this notion, okay, that's very important, the process is all this, but is it or not genocide? That's what I want to know. Because why is this one genocide and this one not genocide? So that's the second. A non-normative vocabulary, I think, would walk away, would help us to sort of disentangle this box of the legal approach, which entails a moralistic consequences in terms of the politics of memory and the study of genocide. The third thing about the global memory of the Holocaust, which I did not mention, is that I think that it should be mentioned, and that the globalization of the Holocaust is not just the globalization of the Holocaust. It's what, in one of his previous works, Alejandro calls the Americanization of the Holocaust. So the global memory of the Holocaust is inscribed in very specific terms in what Enzo Traverso calls the anti-totalitarian liberal consensus that emerged victorious after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So the globalization of the Holocaust, in terms of articulation, has to do with the triumph of liberal democratic perspective, of tolerance, all these are in the quotation, cultural diversity, multiculturalism, respect for plurality, not in the way Hannah Arendt understands it, in the way liberal American thought understands it, human rights, and humanitarian intervention, which was being discussed this morning. That's what informs, in my understanding, my limited understanding, large part of genocide and Holocaust studies. This specific notion of globalized memory of the Holocaust, the Americanization, which is to say the liberal, democratic consensus of the end of history notion of global memory. And that has other consequences, which are very important. That explains, in a way, the sort of reaction of the imperialist paradigm, which, as a reaction, maybe overreacts and overstates its case, but as others have said today, made its contributions. So I think it's very important to specify this notion of a global memory of the Holocaust, which informs or casts a shadow over genocide study in the specificity of what happens after the Cold War and the way this global memory is translated into American liberal democratic values in an age of triumph over totalitarianism.
Well, Irma, thank you for very thoughtful questions, which are not easy to answer. You raised the question about the comparison to the Holocaust, other genocides, and this was the starting point. We had a symposium, was it 3 or 4 years ago, on the representations of genocide, and we had a discussion with in the smaller circle of presenters, and one of the presenters said, well, he didn't think that the name of this center that Alejandro directs is appropriate, or there are some who would challenge this because it elevates the Holocaust from other genocides. There's a special in Jeffrey Alexander's films, is special sacredness of evil. So this is actually exactly the question that you raised that motivated us to been thinking for years about it, to organize this conference in order to arrive at answers. But your question is also a little bit normative. How should we evaluate violence as genocide, right? And I'm not sure if maybe we have to find answers. I could find a very easy way out, of course, by saying I engage in the sociology of knowledge, so I will not answer the how should we question. I study who categorizes what events as genocide and who uses what labels. And in a way, Alejandro does the same, because he says, under what conditions does what Latin American country define the victims of the dictatorship as victims of genocide? It didn't happen everywhere. There were different categorizations used in different Latin American countries. Susie was the same thing, because she looks how the term genocide can be reinterpreted in different national contexts, and some groups are included here and not included elsewhere. Hutu does the same, certainly, when he studies the African definition of genocide, or definition of African countries. I wanted to say one word about the competition of suffering, because I know those debates, and I'm very sensitive to them. Yes, there seems to be we seem to live in a time where there's a special sacredness to the victim status, where maybe also the victim status is associated with expectations, not just of symbolic but material benefits by way of compensation, etc. I also, however, feel a bit comforted by experiencing situations where there is not a competition between groups of victims, but where there is mutual solidarity between groups of victims. A year ago, I was in Yerevan speaking on the occasion of the 101st anniversary of the genocide, the Armenian genocide, and the government had invited speakers who had survived the Cambodian genocide, who had survived the Rwandan genocide, who had survived mass killings in Myanmar, a Yazidi woman who had escaped from the slaughter in Syria. So there was a clear sign of solidarity organized by the Armenian government, maybe also to raise the Armenian case to a level of higher global nationality, but this came certainly together with. Then last fall, I presented, gave a little talk at a group, an activist group, Darfur Women's Action Group in Washington, and this group too had a Darfuri survivor, of course, on the panel. There were some scholars and then there were some survivors, but they also had someone from the DRC on the panel. They also had someone from northern Nigeria on the panel. So that I see increasing numbers of moments where there is solidarity across victim groups, and this is something we ought to pay attention to. It has consequences for our study of genocide, how the responses to it occur, and maybe it's a little, I don't know, sometimes we think something is a hopeful sign and then it turns out to have problematic consequences, but for me at the moment this is a hopeful sign. It is not just about repetition.
Thanks for your question, Sarah. Maybe on the issue of the blind spots or the voids or the silences that the genocide frame leads to. And just let's only think of, well, we could say Spain, for instance. 50,000 so-called victims of so-called red terror. That was the Francoist rhetoric, that these were crimes committed in the rear guard in the Republican zone after the coup. 50,000. Don't mind the number. It's about 30% of the crimes of Franco. So what space do these individuals have in a memory narrative that is binary, that has created this black and white between perpetrators and victims, and that has become hegemonic in the public sphere? Well, it is becoming a public sphere. I would say in Argentina, much more dominant. In Spain, not as much, since it's not as institutionalized. In Argentina, we have the last 15 years a government that has institutionalized memory of the object of a memory of genocide, and that was a term that was used by Cristina Kirchner for the first time when she assumed, when she came into office in 2007. And if we think this would be only the part in terms of transitional justice and memory politics, and how this frame creates this void of somehow not acknowledging those who fall between the cracks of a dominant memory narrative. And 2 weeks ago was the anniversary, the anniversary of the coup, and the slogan, the heading of the rallies, of the marches all over the country was "Fueron 30,000, son 30,000 fue genocidio." They were 30,000. It was genocide. With banners, every city and town all over. So what you see there is that you have also this strictly particularistic frame that is adopted, and it's used against the political adversary nowadays, who are seen as the heirs of the genocide is. It was a commemoration of the coup, but above all, it was a critique of the Macri government, of its neoliberal policy. So this is what I think is the problem when you when the frame becomes hegemonic and is adopted by the media. And I was in Buenos Aires in December. I went to the ESMA. I took a taxi. I went to the ESMA, to this famous clandestine detention and torture center, the biggest one in Buenos Aires. Taxi. Without, I just said, I'm going there. And he was maybe in his early 60s. He remembered that time. And I felt compelled to say something. And he told me a story about his wife who worked in a factory, and there was an attack of the Montoneros, of the guerrilla group. They killed the two gerentes, I don't know what the two managers in the factory. So somehow I found it interesting. Right? We know about this, but he felt compelled to say, he needed to say that time that he lived is not represented correctly within that dominant memory network, of which the Esma Museum and Memorial, the big project of the Kirchner government, now contested, I would say, to some extent for good reasons also, because of its politicization. But somehow he was illuminating that blind spot that are there, and to which the genocide brain has, to that act of it has functioned. So I'll leave it there.
Our students.
Yeah, students.
Susie? Oh.
It's on. Thanks for your questions. The blind spot question, thinking about that is interesting. As Alejandro was talking about fitting Argentina into this mold, into this frame, think about the Argentina's law, which adopts verbatim, actually just references if the international law doesn't actually incorporate the language itself into their law. And so at first I thought, that's so strange. I thought that there would be more of a representation of this violence, of this, of their experience in the law itself. And yet it makes so much sense in light of what you have been saying about trying to fit an experience within this frame. And then what gets left out of that, right? And on the other hand, then you have cases where you have expanded categories, and what gets left out, or what gets left out when you broaden this conception. I think we have to continue to think about the ways that these kinds of legal representations then get translated and reflect or do not reflect the personal experiences and the actual violence itself.
Thanks. I see this in my work as well, and both with how conflicts in Africa are talked about within the press, but also how African journalists make sense of this, right? Because we almost have this notion that if it's a conflict in Africa, it's either just as bad as Rwanda, not that bad, but could get that bad, so we need to do something, or it's just Africans doing what Africans do, right? We machete people every Monday morning because we're bored. And there's always this weird framing. So we saw this in Central African Republic, where I think it was Slate magazine has this big bold headline saying Samantha Power stops another Rwanda, right? And Samantha Power is walking out, and there are AU troops behind her, and all of this other stuff, right? And it's this idea of fitting into a mold, and what does that actually do, right? And I've written about this in relation to Burundi, and I'm always curious as to, do we only care about atrocities in African countries if they're called genocide? It's not we as academics necessarily, but just the general we, right? The general audience. Does it only matter if it's a genocide? Is that all we're known for? Because every time I tell people, I studied this, mass atrocity, I studied genocide, and I'm from Africa, they go, oh, is this something that happened to your country? I go, no. No. I mean, we're actually pretty chill. But it's that it's that idea, and we leave out a lot of other people suffer, right? Because it doesn't meet the threshold, or it's not as easy enough. So when I speak to African journalists, they say, I don't call Darfur a genocide personally because there are 47 other conflicts going on. Why Darfur, right? Why was this the one that everybody picked? And they're torn about this, and they say, the only time I use the phrase genocide is if the ICC uses it, or if the UN uses it. So they're pretty against this, right? This notion that it's a genocide, so we care. And that's to link back to your items one, Rwanda hardly called Darfur a genocide. They just did not. I mean, just 13% of the articles called Darfur a genocide, right? So there's this almost not fear, but hesitance. And I see it with the African journalists. I don't see it on the outside where Nick Christopher and I are quite willing to say, this, Rwanda, right, Slate, Central African Republic, oh, Rwanda. And that's a problem. That's, it's exclusionary and inclusionary at the same time. And we don't learn anything about these places. We don't learn anything about the unique instances that Holly was talking about this morning, where in one place, the genocidal conflict doesn't get to the place until 2 weeks after. Because all we know is that Rwanda was a genocide started on this state, boom, right? And the state is also co-opting this narrative because it helps the state, right? And the victims as well, it puts the memory out there. So what is our job as scholars? To try and delineate this. Wish you all the best. I'm still trying to find that. But, I see where you're coming from. And that's been my experience with journalists. It's a struggle, in fact.
With the question of competing accusations, I have grew up in a family of human rights defenders, and I have heard these stories about competing, like my father competing with human rights defenders in Guatemala, who is the worst case, either Guatemala or El Salvador, which is in the worst case. So I have heard these stories. And I think it's complicated being a scholar and a lawyer because when taking testimony from people, I think, because I'm not arguing that the whole Salvadoran war was a genocide. I'm just arguing that torture operations were genocidal practices, not the whole war. So when I speak to people, it's kind of complicated to them explaining that a massacre was not a genocide and that torture operation was a genocide, or what happened to them was not a genocide, because they kind of feel disappointed when they hear that the experience that they did was not a genocide, because the word genocide impacts them, like it resonates into their narrative. So I think it brings something, that it's something special. So yeah, I don't know. Something complicated in the term.
Thank you. Okay, what we're going to do now is I'm going to collect 3 more questions, and then the panelists can answer. So,
I have a question for Joachim, and I don't know if it's a question or a comment for Carlos and Alejandro. So first the question is more detailed. You had this statistic about France and the Armenians just at the end. I had not time to get into it. But I was struck that in 2015 there was not a spike. Because from my experience in the US, there was a spike. So it's interesting, why was there no spike in kind of denial in France in 2015 at the end of the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide? So this was just a detailed question. If you have an answer, I would be interested. And for Carlos and Alejandro, I mean, if we talk about memory and public memory, there are shifts that are quick and changes are happening. But I'm struck that in the discussion about the Argentinian dictatorship and the attempt to kind of mold this into a genocide, that there's no reference at all, at least from my limited insights, when I read the scholarship, to the history of mass violence in Argentina before. which has nothing to do with the Holocaust against the indigenous population. I'm struck by this. And there is scholarship, a little bit of scholarship on this, but it's totally separated. And I was wondering, what is this? Is this just the extension of our Eurocentristic understanding of genocide? That this plays no role at all? And I extend this even to what you can have the kind of in-house discussion about the United States, where there's so much talk about Rwanda, about the Armenian genocide, about the Holocaust, but if you go to the Native Americans, it kind of gets very quickly very quiet. And so, just this is a...
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for your inspiring lectures, including the presentation of the dissertation project. I have two questions, but I'll just leave it with one question to Alejandro and Carlos Pavón, maybe. And it connects a bit to the question that Wolf Brunner just asked. Besides the explanations that you gave, Alejandro, why people related in Argentina to the Holocaust, I thought that if we think of a country that is, where it's absolutely logical that they connect to this history, it's Argentina, because you have so many people that unify both histories in their biography. You have so many survivors of the Shoah, and then they go to Argentina, and then their children are persecuted by the junta. So, and I was asking myself all the time, what does it mean? You know, what is this specific phenomenon? How does it change the perception? Because you cannot speak of a competition of victimhood, because they unify both histories, and even though there might be structural differences in the regime and better comparisons to other regimes, that is the point of experience where they start.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just keep going.
Okay, sure. I was just thinking too that Argentina was the place where the ex-Nazis, but Angola. So maybe that associates Argentina with genocide more so.
You would like us to answer? Yes. So there was one question for me, and the slide went by very fast. So it's easy to misread. 1915 actually was one of two peak years of the Unionist actions that were recorded by this group. So 93 Unionist actions. The only year that has a high number is 2010. In January of 2011, the Senate, the second chamber of the legislature, passed a law that would criminalize the denial of the Armenian genocide, and so this was the year leading up to that Senate vote. So indeed, it is a particular political event, and then it is the centennial that evoke the largest number of denialist statements. Just for clarification. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I think to start with Elke's point. Yes, definitely. But I would assume that under this rubric of Argentinians, Jewish Argentinians, 250,000, that's committed 250,000, a very, I would say, integrated community, which led to the fact that many were involved in the labor unions, in the militant movement, in the 70s, which then explains that there is such a significant number of Jewish desaparecidos, or desaparecidos of Jewish origin. Because they were not actively involved with Jews, but they had Jewish last names, their background was Jewish. It's 1,900 people. Again, depending what number you take, or the full number, whether it's 10,000 documented cases or 30,000, because it's politics, iconography. demographic number, which is now, by the way, also being contested, and there are good reasons to contest it. Because 40 years after, or 30 years after the Truth Commission report, if you still have such a disparity in numbers, there's a side note between 10,000 and 30,000. Well, there are some people, and that doesn't mean denial, but are saying we might revise that estimate. And this is perceived as genocide denial. So who raises that claim is automatically pushed into the corner of the genocide. This Argentinian polarization is dramatic. So, but this is a side note, the Jewish literature has contributed fundamentally and testimony to the adoption of the Holocaust paradigm. And Jacobo Timmerman, that translates so many languages, the prisoner without a name, the cell without a number, that he directly, when he starts, he tells the story of his family, he in Russia, and during the Nazi time, and then he says, and now it's my generation who is suffering somehow the same fate. So he, as a witness, is a journalist, director of law business. So, like himself, many other former political prisoners, Vietnamese, make that connection, and that definitely is one of the sources that very much shape them. So I think it's a multiplicity of elements, but again, it boils down to the presence of this Argentinians of Jewish origin with that background that will highlight this. And we might say also for good reasons at a point, because it leads or it helps to push back or to push back the warframe, which was the legitimation of the military regime. But again, it has these consequences that I think it's important to highlight. Of the native population, in the last 10 years in Argentina, there has been no scholarship. I would say this, well, we might say this is a good outcome of the revision and the salient of the genocide attempt. This is coming up. I don't think still it has the significance as that's something definitely. But I think there has been progress in the last decade in that respect. And there is a debate whether, as in all cases, whether the persecution in the Araucanía in the south constitutes genocide.
Yes, I agree with Alejandro. I think that it's, in terms of the question, that there are good reasons, historically good reasons, sound reasons for this. There's an article that I always forget the author, Julio del Sur. The notion that Argentinians are los judíos del sur. And she goes through the literature. She documents how this paradigm is ingrained in the literature. And yesterday, Clarín had a long article on the problems and how to face the education, the pedagogy of the Holocaust in Argentina. And there's a whole historical account of how in the 40s in Argentina, the Holocaust was a matter of public debate. Presence of the Jewish community, so it's not a phenomenon that you can just put the military coup as the border or the frontier. Having said that, I think that an interesting case to comparison is Argentina and Chile, because Argentina is also very exceptional in that the memory of repression emerges in the moment that it is almost ending or still happening. That is in the guerras contra las Malvinas War. I mean, it's not belated. It's very amazing in that sense that all these associations and groups, hijos and all this, they emerge right there in the struggle in the Malvinas Wars, and they start to claim this memory of the disappearance and the repression, and that goes against the grain about the period of forgetting and the notion that you need a generation and then it's belated, the traumatic memory and all that. That's exceptional, especially if you compare with Chile. And also that the process that brings down la junta is the war, the defeat of the war, right? So it's the culmination of a social struggle. And that rupture, because it was really unexpected and quick, meant that I think this process could take hold in a way that in Chile, it's a much longer dictatorship. The transition looks more like the transition in Spain, la concertación. Pinochet dies in his bed. He was senator for life. He was never charged. So the weakness of the social memory, public memory in Chile is interesting because there's not only the Jewish question, I'll put it that way, or the Jewish population historically, but also because of the way the regimes end and how that facilitates or does not facilitate a politics of memory. But interestingly, in Chile, the blind spot of the violence against indigenous population has had more echo than in Argentina. Precisely because of that. So the displacement has been, we can't deal with the trauma of Pinochet, we had a pact, and this is not to be talked about, until Bachelet had the museum done. But they have started to really study the violence because Mapuches are politically active in Chile now. So the displacement is also politics of the present. There is a presence of that indigenous population actively struggling in Chile, which is not the case, if I'm not mistaken, in Argentina. So that's a very, I always find that that's a good case to be done. It hasn't been done. This comparison between Argentina and Chile, because it's really, really a contrast. Okay, we can do that.
Thank you. Well, since we're out of time, I'm going to have to close the session, but I encourage you all to keep asking questions and talking about it. I think there's something right coming up.
Yes, we will be meeting for dinner.
We are the presenters and the session chairs.
The presenters and session chairs, so maybe if you could wait here and we'll give you directions on how to go to the restaurant.
Which is at what time?
Which is 6.
Reserved for 6 o'clock, right?
6:15, right?
6:15.
6:15, so where? Go from here.
Town hall.